Chapter 18 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 18. And They're Still Flying. Transcriber's Note: the following 3 chapters were added to the second edition text in 1960. 4 years have passed since the first 17 chapters of this book were written. During this period, hundreds of unidentified flying objects have been seen and reported to the Air Force. Pilots, with thousands of hours of flying time, are still reporting them. Radar operators, experts in their field, are still tracking them. And crews on the missile test ranges are photographing them. UFOs are not just a fad. The Air Force's Project Blue Book is still very active. Not a week passes that one of the many teams of its nationwide investigation net is not in the field investigating a new UFO report. To pick up the history of the UFO, the best place to start is Cincinnati, Ohio, in the late summer of 1955. For some unknown reason, one of those mysterious factors of the UFO, reports from this Hamilton County city suddenly began to pick up. Mass hysteria, the old crutch, wasn't a factor because neither the press, the radio, nor TV was even mentioning the words flying saucer. The reports weren't much in terms of quality. Some lady would see a bobbing white light, or a man, putting his car away, would see a star jump. These reports, usually passed on to the Air Force through the Air Defense Command's Ground Observer Corps, merely went on the UFO plotting board as a statistic. But before long, in a matter of a week or two, the mass of reports began to draw some official attention because the Ground Observer Corps spotters themselves began to make UFO reports. At times during the middle of August, the telephone lines from the GOC observation posts in Hamilton County, Greater Cincinnati, to the filter center in Columbus would be jammed. Now, even the most cynical Air Force types were begrudgingly raising their eyebrows. These GOC observers were about as close to experts as you can get. Many had spent hundreds of hours scanning the skies since the GOC went into the operation in 1952 to close the gaps in our radar net. Many held awards for meritorious service. They weren't crackpots. But still the cynics held out. This was really nothing new. The Project Blue Book files were full of similar incidents. In 1947 there had been a rash of reports from the Pacific Northwest. In 1948 there had been a similar outbreak at Edwards Air Force Base, the super-secret test center in the Mojave Desert of California. In 1949 the sightings centered in the Midwest. None had panned out to be anything. Then came the clincher. On the night of August 23rd, shortly before midnight, reports of a UFO began to come in from the Mount Healthy GOC observation post northwest of Cincinnati. Almost simultaneously, Air Defense Command radar picked up a target in that area. A minute or two later, the Forestville and Loveland GOC posts, also in Hamilton County, made sightings. Now, 3 UFOs, described as brilliant white spheres, swinging in a pendulum-like motion, were on the ADC plotting boards, confirmed by radar. All pretext of ignoring the UFOs was dropped, and at 11:58 p.m., F-84s of the Ohio Air National Guard were scrambled. They were over Cincinnati at 12:10 a.m. and made contact. Boring in at 20,000 feet at 100% power, they closed, but the UFOs left them as if they were standing still. The battle in the Cincinnati sector was on. Almost every night more UFOs were reported by the GOC. Attempts were made to scramble interceptors, but there were no more radar contacts, and a jet interceptor without ground guidance is worthless. At the height of this activity, it was decided that more information was needed by the Air Defense Command. Maybe from a mass of data, some kind of clue could be sifted out. The answer? Establish a special UFO reporting post. The man to operate this post was tailor-made. On September 9th, Major Hugh McKenzie of the Columbus Filter Center contacted Leonard H. Stringfield in Cincinnati. Stringfield, besides being a very public-minded citizen, was also known as a level-headed saucer expert. Sooner or later, usually sooner, he heard about every UFO sighting in Hamilton County. He was given a code, Foxtrot Kilo 3-0 Blue, which provided him with an open telephone line to the ADC Filter Center in Columbus. He was in business, but he didn't have to build up a clientele. It was there. For the next few months, Stringfield did yeoman duty as Cincinnati's one-man UFO center by sifting out the wheat from the chaff and passing the wheat on to the Air Force. As he told me the other day, half his nights were spent in his backyard, clad in shorts and binoculars. Fortunately, his neighbors were broad-minded and the UFOs picked relatively warm nights to appear. Most of the reports Stringfield received were duds. He lost track of the number. The green, red, blue, gold, and white, discs, triangles, squares, and footballs, which hovered, streaked, zigzagged, and jerked, turned out to be Venus, Jupiter, Arcturus, and an occasional jet. A fiery orange satellite which hovered for hours turned out to be the North Star viewed through a cheap telescope, and the whole formation of spaceships were the Pleiades. Then it happened again. On the evening of March 23rd, Stringfield's telephone rang. It was Charles Deininger at the Mount Healthy GOC post. They had a UFO in sight off to the east. Could Stringfield see it? He grabbed his extension phone and ran outdoors. There, off to the east, were two large, low-flying lights. One of the lights was a glowing green and the other yellow. They were moving north. Airplane! This was Stringfield's first reaction, but during World War II he had made the long trek up the Pacific with the famous 5th Air Force, and he immediately realized that if it was an airplane it would have to be very close because of the large distance between the lights. And as a clincher, no sound came through the still night. He dialed the long-distance operator and said the magic words, "This is Foxtrot Kilo 3-0 Blue." Seconds later he was talking to the duty sergeant at the Columbus Filter Center. A few more seconds and the sergeant had his story. Another jet was scrambled, and this time Stringfield, via a radio-telephone hookup to the airplane, gave the pilot a vector. Stringfield heard the jet closing in, but since it was a one-way circuit, he couldn't hear the pilot's comments. Once again, the UFO took off. This was a fitting climax for the Cincinnati flap. As suddenly as it began, it quit, and from the mass of data that was collected, the Air Force got zero information. In the Mystery League, the UFOs were still ahead. Although the majority of the UFO activity during the last half of 1955 and early 1956 centered in the Cincinnati area, there were other good reports. Near Banning, California, on November 25, 1955, Gene Miller, manager of the Banning Municipal Airport, and Dr. Leslie Ward, a physician, were paced by a globe of white light which suddenly backed up in midair, while in Miller's airplane. It was the same old story. Miller was an experienced pilot, a former Air Force instructor and air freight pilot with several thousand hours flying time. Commercial pilots came in for more than their share of the sightings in 1956. On January 22, UFO investigators talked to the crew of a Pan American airliner. That night at 8:30 p.m., the Houston to Miami DC-7B had been abeam of New Orleans, out over the Gulf of Mexico. There was a partial moon shining through small wisps of high cirrus clouds, but generally it was a clear night. The captain of the flight was back in the cabin chatting with the passengers. The co-pilot and engineer were alone on the flight deck. The engineer had moved up from his control panel and was sitting beside the co-pilot. At 8:30 it was time for a radio position report, and the co-pilot, Tom Tompkins, leaned down to set up a new frequency on the radio controls. Robert Mueller, the engineer, was on watch for other aircraft. It was 10, maybe 20 seconds after Tompkins leaned down that Mueller just barely perceived a pinpoint of moving light off to his right. Even before his thought processes could tell him it might be another airplane, the light began to grow in size. Within a short 6 seconds it streaked across the nose of the airliner, coming out of the Gulf and disappearing inland over Mississippi or Alabama. Tompkins, the co-pilot, never saw it because Mueller was too astounded to even utter a sound. But Mueller had a good look. The body of the object was shaped like a bullet and gave off a pale, luminescent blue glow. The stubby tail, or exhaust, was marked by spurts of yellow flame or light. The size? Mueller, like any experienced observer, had no idea since he didn't know how far away it was. But it was big. One sentence, dangling at the bottom of the report, was one I'd seen many, many times before. Mr. Mueller was a complete skeptic regarding UFO reports. During 1956 there was a rumor, I heard it many times, that the Air Force had entered into a grand conspiracy with the U.S. news media to stamp out the UFO. The common people of the world, the rumor had it, were not yet psychologically conditioned to learn that we had been visited by superior beings. By not ever mentioning the words unidentified flying object, the public would forget and go on their merry stupid way. I heard this rumor so often, in fact, that I began to wonder myself. But a few dollars invested in martinis for old buddies in the Kitty Hawk room of the Biltmore Hotel in Dayton, or the men's bar in the Statler Hotel in Washington, produces a lot of straight and reliable information, much better than you get through official channels. There was no silence order, I learned, only the same old routine. If the files at ATIC were open to the public, it would take a staff of a dozen people to handle all the inquiries. Secondly, many of the inquiries come from saucer screwballs, and these people are like a hypochondriac at the doctor's. Nothing will make them believe the diagnosis unless it is what they came in to hear. And there are plenty of saucer screwballs. One officer summed it up neatly when he told me, "It isn't the UFOs that give us the trouble, it's the people." As a double check, I called several newspaper editors the other day and asked, "Why don't you print more UFO stories?" The answers were simple. It's the old dog bites man bit. 99% have no news value anymore. On May 10, 1956, the man bit the dog. A string of UFO sightings in Pueblo, Colorado, hit the front pages of newspapers across the United States. Starting on the night of May 5th, for 6 nights, the citizens of Pueblo, including the Ground Observer Corps, saw UFOs zip over their community. As usual, there were various descriptions, but everyone agreed they'd never seen anything like it before. On the sixth night, the Air Force sent in an investigator and he saw them. Between the hours of 9:00 p.m. and midnight, he saw 6 groups of triangular-shaped objects that glowed with a dull fluorescence, faint but bright enough to see. They passed from horizon to horizon in 6 seconds. The next day, this investigator was called back to Colorado Springs, his base, and a fresh team was sent to Pueblo. The man really chomped down on the dog in July, and the UFO really made headlines. Maybe it was because a fellow newspaper editor was involved, along with the Kansas Highway Patrol, the Navy, and the Air Force. Or maybe it was simply because it was a good UFO sighting. About the time Miss Iowa was being judged Miss USA in the 1956 Miss Universe pageant at Long Beach, the city editor of Arkansas City Daily Traveler and a trooper of the Kansas State Highway Patrol were sitting in a patrol cruiser in Arkansas City. It was a hot and muggy night. Occasionally the radio in the cruiser would come to life. An accident near Salina. A drunk driving south from Topeka. Another accident near Wichita. But generally, south central Kansas was dead. The newspaper editor was about ready to go home. It was 10 o'clock, when the small talk he and the trooper had been making was brought to an abrupt finale by 3 high-pitched beeps from the cruiser's radio. An important all-cars bulletin was coming. 25 years as a newspaperman had trained the editor to always be on the alert for a story, so he reached down and turned up the volume. Within seconds, he had his story. "The Hutchinson Naval Air Station is picking up an unidentified target on their radar," the voice of the dispatcher said, with as much of an excited tone as a police dispatcher can have. "Take a look." Then the dispatcher went on to say that the target was moving in a semicircular area that reached out from 50 to 75 miles east of Hutchinson. A B-47 from McConnell Air Force Base at Wichita was in the area, searching. The last fix on the object showed it to be near Emporia in Marion County. The 2 men in the patrol cruiser looked at each other for a second or two. Like all newspaper editors, this man had had his belly full of flying saucer reports, but this was a little different. "Let's go out and look," he said, fully doubting that they would see anything. They drove to a hill in the north part of the city where they could get a good view of the sky and parked. In a few minutes an Arkansas City police car joined them. It was a clear night except for a few wispy clouds scattered across the north sky. They waited, they looked, and they saw. Shortly before midnight, off to the north, appeared a brilliantly lighted, teardrop-shaped blob of light. Prongs, or streams of bright light, sprayed downward from the blob toward the earth. It was big, about the size of a 200-watt light bulb. As the group of men silently watched, the weird light continued to drift, and for many minutes it moved vertically and horizontally over a wide area of the sky. Then it faded away. As one of the men later told me, "I was glad to see it go. I was pooped." The next morning literally hundreds of people spent hours conjecturing and describing. After all these years of talk, they'd actually seen one. Several photos, showing the big blob of light, were shown around, and 2 fishermen readily admitted they'd packed up their poles and tackle boxes and headed home when they saw it. Editor Coyne summed up the feeling of hundreds of Kansans when he said, "I have tended to discount the stories about flying objects, but brother, I am now a believer." What was it? First of all, it was confusion. Early the next morning, Air Force investigators flooded the area asking the questions: what size was it in comparison to a key or a dime? Would it compare in size to a light bulb? Was there any noise? As soon as they left, the military tersely announced that no radar had picked up any target and no B-47s had been sent out. Then they pulled the plugs on the incoming phone lines. The confusion mounted when newsmen tapped their private sources and learned that a B-47 had been sent into the area. A few days later, the Air Force told the Kansans what they'd seen: the reflection from burning waste gas torches in a local oil field. This was greeted with the Kansan version of the Bronx cheer. 1956 was a big year for Project Blue Book. According to an old friend, Captain George Gregory, who was then chief of Blue Book, they received 778 reports. And through a lot of sleepless nights they were able to solve 97.8% of them. Only 17 remained unknowns. Digging through the reports for 1956, outside of the ones already mentioned, there were few real good ones. In Banning, California, Ground Observer Corps spotters watched a balloon-like object make 3 rectangular circuits around the town. In Plymouth, New Hampshire, 2 GOC spotters reported a bright yellow object which left a trail similar to a jet moving slowly at a very high altitude. At Rosebury, Oregon, state police received many reports of funny green and red lights moving slowly around a television transmitter tower. And in Hartford, Connecticut, 2 amateur astronomers, looking at Saturn through a 4-inch telescope, were distracted by a bright light. Turning their telescopes on it, they observed a large whitish-yellow light, shaped like a 10-gallon hat. Many other people evidently saw the same UFO, because the local newspaper said, "Reports have been pouring in." In Miami, a Pan American Airlines radar operator tracked a UFO at speeds up to 4,000 miles an hour. 5 of his skeptical fellow radar operators watched and were confirmed. At Moneymore, Northern Ireland, a level-headed and God-fearing citizen and his wife captured an 18-inch saucer by putting a headlock on it. They started to the local police station, but put the saucer down to climb over a hedge, and it went whirling off to the hinterlands of space. The 27th Air Defense Division, that guards the vast aircraft and missile centers of Southern California, was alerted on the night of September 9th. In rapid succession, a Western Airlines pilot making an approach to Los Angeles International Airport, the Ground Observer Corps, and numerous Los Angeles citizens called in a white light moving slowly across the Los Angeles basin. When the big defense radars on San Clemente Island picked up an unknown target in the same area that the light was being reported, 2 F-89 jet interceptors were scrambled but saw nothing. A few days later, investigators learned that a $27.65 weather balloon had caused the many $1,000s worth of excitement. The matter of scrambling interceptors has been a sore point with the UFO business for a long time. Many people believe that the mere fact the Air Force will send up 2, 3, or even 4 aircraft that cost $2,000 an hour to fly is proof positive that the Air Force doesn't believe its own story that UFOs don't exist. The official answer you'll get, if you ask the Air Force, is that they scramble against any unknown target as a matter of defense. But over coffee, you get a different answer. They write the UFO scrambles off as training cost. Each pilot has to get so much flying time, and simulating intercepts against an unidentified light is more interesting than merely burning holes in the air. If appropriations are ever cut to the point where training must be curtailed, and, heaven forbid, there will be no more scrambles after flying saucers. And the colonel who told me this was emphatic. The year 1957 was heralded in by a startling announcement which ended a long dry spell of UFO news. At a press conference in Washington, D.C., retired Admiral Delmer S. Farney made a statement. Newspapers across the country carried it complete or in part, and people read the statement with interest, because Admiral Farney is well known as a sensible and knowledgeable man. He had fought for and built up the Navy's guided missile program back in the days when people who talked of ballistic missiles and satellites had to fight for their beliefs. First, Admiral Farney announced that a non-profit organization, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, had been established to investigate UFO reports. He would be chairman of the Board of Governors, and his board would consist of such potent names as retired Vice Admiral R. H. Hillenkoetter, for 2 years the director of the super-secret Central Intelligence Agency, retired Lieutenant General P. A. Del Valle, ex-commanding general of the famous 1st Marine Division, retired Rear Admiral Herbert B. Knowles, noted submariner of World War II. Then Admiral Farney read a statement regarding the policies of NICAP. It was as follows: reliable reports indicate that there are objects coming into our atmosphere at very high speeds. No agency in this country or Russia is able to duplicate at this time the speeds and accelerations which radars and observers indicate these flying objects are able to achieve. There are signs that an intelligence directs these objects because of the way they fly. The way they change position in formations would indicate that their motion is directed. The Air Force is collecting factual data on which to base an opinion, but time is required to sift and correlate the material. As long as such unidentified objects continue to navigate through the Earth's atmosphere, there is an urgent need to know the facts. Many observers have ceased to report their findings to the Air Force because of the seeming frustration, that is, all information going in and none coming out. It is in this area that NICAP may find its greatest mission. We are in a position to screen independently all UFO information coming in from our filter groups. General Albert C. Wiedemeyer will serve the committee as evaluations advisor, and complete analyses will be arranged through leading scientists. After careful evaluation, we shall release our findings to the public. Donald Keyhoe, a retired Marine Corps major and author of 3 top-seller UFO books, was appointed director. The mere fact that another civilian UFO investigative group was being born was neither news nor UFO history, because since 1947, well over 100 such organizations had been formed. Many still exist. Many flopped. But none deserve the niche in UFO history that does NICAP. NICAP had power, and it raised a storm that took months to calm down. NICAP got off to a fast start. Dues were pegged at $7.50 a year, which included a subscription to the very interesting magazine The UFO Investigator, and the operation went into high gear. With such names as Farney, Wiedemeyer, Hillenkoetter, Del Valle, and Knowles for prestige, and Keyhoe for intrigue, saucer fans all over the United States packaged up their 750 and mailed it to headquarters. Each, in turn, became a listening post and an investigator. Keyhoe set up a panel of special advisors, all saucer fans, to impartially evaluate the UFO reports ferreted out by the listening posts, based on facts uncovered by the investigators. Even though the leading scientists Farney mentioned in his statement never materialized, NICAP was cocked, primed, and ready. To get things off to a gala start, Keyhoe, as director of NICAP, wrote to the Air Force and set out NICAP's 8-point plan. In essence, this plan suggested, some say demanded, that the Air Force let NICAP ride herd on Project Blue Book. First of all, NICAP wanted its panel of special advisors to review and concur with all of the conclusions on the thousands of UFO reports that the Air Force had in its files. This went over like a worm in the punch bowl. First of all, the Air Force didn't feel it was necessary to review its files. Secondly, they knew NICAP. If every balloon, planet, airplane, and bird that caused a UFO report hadn't been captured and a signed confession wrung out, the UFO would be a visitor from outer space. The Air Force decided to ignore NICAP. But NICAP wouldn't be ignored. They bombarded everyone from the Secretary of the Air Force on down with telephone calls, telegrams, and letters. Still, the Air Force remained silent. Then NICAP headquarters called in the troops, and members from all corners of the nation cut loose. The barrage of mail broke the logjam, and just enough information to constitute an answer dribbled out of the office of the Secretary of the Air Force. But this didn't satisfy Keyhoe or his UFO-hungry NICAPions. They wanted blood, and that blood had to taste like spaceships or they wouldn't be happy. The cudgel they picked up next was powerful. The Air Force had said that there was nothing classified about Project Blue Book, yet NICAP hadn't seen every blessed scrap of paper in the Air Force UFO files. This was unwarranted censorship. While Congress was right in the middle of such important and crucial problems as foreign policy, atomic disarmament, racketeering, integration, and 12 other problems, NICAP began to bedevil every senator and representative who was polite enough to listen. It's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and in November 1957, the United States Senate Committee on Government Operations began an inquiry concerning UFOs. I gave my testimony, and so did others who had been associated with Project Blue Book. A few weeks later, the inquiry was dropped. But NICAP had made its name. Of all of the thorns that have been pounded into the UFO side of the Air Force, NICAP drove theirs the deepest. In the midst of all this mess, Admiral Farney, General Wedemeyer, and General DeValley, politely and quietly, resigned from NICAP's Board of Governors. Neither the loss of these famous names nor the defeat at the hands of the Air Force has stopped NICAP. They continue to forge ahead, undaunted. In many UFO incidents they have actually uncovered additional and sometimes interesting information. NICAP Director Don Keyhoe has taken a beating, being accused of profiteering, trying to make headlines, and other minor social crimes. But personally, I doubt this. Keyhoe is simply convinced that UFOs are from outer space, and he's a dedicated man. While the big NICAP Air Force battle was going on, the UFOs were not waiting to see who won. They were still flying. At Ellington Air Force Base, Texas, a ground observer corps team spotted a UFO and passed it on to a radar crew. Although the radar crew couldn't pick it up on their sets, they saw it visually. The lieutenant in charge told investigators how it crossed from horizon to horizon in 45 seconds. On March 9th, several passengers on a New York to San Juan, Puerto Rico airliner were injured when the pilot pulled the big DC-6 up sharply to miss a large greenish-white, clearly circular-shaped object which was on a collision course with the plane. The pilots of several other airliners in the same airway confirmed the sighting. 2 weeks later, jet interceptors were scrambled over Los Angeles to look for a UFO. According to the records, the first report of the brilliant and mysterious flashing red light came from a man in the east part of Pasadena. But his report was quickly lost in the shuffle as more and more calls began to come in. As the flashing light crossed the Los Angeles basin from southeast to northwest, hundreds of people saw it. Traffic was tied up on the Rose Parade famous Colorado Boulevard as drivers stopped their cars to get out and look. As it neared the Air Defense Command Filter Center in Pasadena, the Filter Center personnel, those that could be spared, went out and looked. They saw it. Police switchboards lit up a solid red as it crossed the San Gabriel Valley. Near midnight, a CAA radar picked up unidentified targets near the Oxnard Air Force Base at Oxnard, California, northwest of Los Angeles, and at almost that identical time, people on the airbase saw the light. This did it, and 2 powerful jets, equipped with all-weather radar, came screaming into the area. But it was the same old story. No contact. The UFO was gone. The Midwest was visited on the morning of May 23rd, when 5 observers in Kansas City saw 4 silver, disc-shaped objects flying in formation at extremely high speed. At one point during their flight, 2 of the objects broke formation and veered off, but soon rejoined. It took the objects only 4 minutes to cross the sky. There were other reports during the first half of 1957, 250 of them to be exact, and many could be classified as good. But they were nothing compared to those that were to come. On November 3, 1957, a rash of sightings broke out in Texas, and they had a brand new twist. To do things upright, the powers that guide the UFO picked the town of Levelland, only 27 miles west of Lubbock, the home of the now traditional Lubbock Lights. It was with a tug of nostalgia that I read about these reports, because 5 years before, almost to the day, Lubbock had plunged the Air Force and me into the UFO mystery on a grand scale. According to the best interpretation of the maze of conflicting stories, facts, and rumors about these famous sightings, the only positive fact is that there were scattered storm clouds across West Texas on the night of November 4, 1957. This was unusual for November, and everyone in the community was just a little edgy. It was early in the evening, at least early for West Texas on a Saturday night, when Pedro Saucedo, a farm worker, and his friend Joe Salaz started out in Saucedo's truck toward Pettit, 10 miles northwest of Levelland. They had just turned off State Highway 116 and were heading north on a country road when the 2 men saw a flash of light in an adjacent field. Saucedo, a Korean War veteran, and Salaz didn't pay much attention to the light at first. They only noticed that it was coming closer. "It seemed to be paralleling us and edging a little closer all the time," Saucedo later recalled. Still, neither man paid any attention to the light. They drove on, Saucedo watching the road and Salaz talking. Then it hit. The first signal of something wrong was when the truck headlights went out. Then the engine stopped. Before Saucedo could hit the starter again, he glanced over his left shoulder. A huge ball of fire was rapidly drifting toward the truck. Without a second's hesitation, Saucedo did what the Korean War had taught him to do when in doubt. He shoved open the car door and hit the dirt. Salaz just sat. "The thing passed directly over my truck with a great sound and a rush of wind," Saucedo later told County Sheriff Weir Clem after he'd started his truck and had driven back to Levelland. "It sounded like thunder and my truck rocked from the blast. I felt a lot of heat." The thing which disappeared across the prairie looked like a fiery tornado. 5 years before and a little east of where Saucedo and Salaz were buzzed, I had talked to two women who described almost an identical UFO, and it remains unknown to this day. In Levelland, the two men's story would have been enough to keep Sheriff Clem busy for the rest of the night, but between the hours of 8:15 P.M. and midnight on the 2nd, the Levelland thing struck 5 more times. James D. Long, a Waco truck driver, came upon it 4 miles west of Levelland and fainted as it roared over his truck. Ronald Martin, another truck driver, was stopped east of Levelland, as was Newell Wright, a Texas Tech student. Jim Wheeler, Jose Alvarez, and Frank Williams added their stories to the melee. All of those who had been attacked told Sheriff Clem a similar story. The thing was shaped something like an egg standing on end. It was fiery red, more like a red neon light. It was about 200 feet long and was about 200 feet in the air. When it came close to cars, the engines would stop and the lights would go out. "Everyone," Sheriff Clem said, "seemed very excited." That night, everyone in West Texas saw UFOs. Sheriff Clem saw a brilliant light in the distance. Highway Patrolman Lee Hargrove and Floyd Cavan reported similar brilliant lights at the same time, but from a different location. The control tower operators at the Amarillo Airport, to the north, saw a blue gaseous object which moved swiftly and left an amber trail. There were dozens more. It was a memorable Saturday night in Levelland. But unbeknownst to Sheriff Clem or the residents of West Texas, they weren't alone on the visitors list. At 2:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, only a few hours after the thing raised havoc around Levelland, an Army Military Police Patrol was cruising the super-secret White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Here is their report as they gave it to Air Force UFO investigators. At approximately 02:30, 3 November 1957, Source, together with Private First Class X, were on a routine patrol of the up-range area of the White Sands Proving Ground when Source noticed a very bright object high in the sky. This object slowly descended to an altitude estimated to be approximately 50 yards, where it remained motionless for about 3 minutes. Then it descended to the ground, where the light went out. The object was not blurred or fuzzy, emitted no vapor or smoke. The object was in view for about 10 minutes, and Source estimated that it was approximately 2 or 3 miles away. It was estimated to be between 75 and 100 yards in diameter and shaped like an egg. Source stated that it was as large as a grapefruit held at arm's length. The weather was cold, drizzling, and windy, and Source stated no stars were visible. After the light went out, Source and Private First Class X continued north to the Stallion Site Camp and reported the incident to the Sergeant of the Guard, who returned to the area but failed to find anything. The flap was on. On Monday, the 4th, the Levelland thing struck again near the White Sands Proving Ground. James Stokes, a 20-year Navy veteran and an electronics engineer, had the engine of his new Mercury stopped as a brilliant, egg-shaped object made a pass at the highway. As it went over, Stokes said, "It felt like the radiation of a giant sun lamp." Stokes said there were 10 other carloads of people stopped, but if this is true, no one ever found out who they were. The Air Force wrote off Stokes' story as hoax, presumably suggested by the Levelland, Texas reports. Maybe the Air Force didn't believe James Stokes, but when the Coast Guard cutter Seabago radioed in their report from the Gulf of Mexico, wheels began to turn, fast. On Tuesday morning, the 5th, the Seabago was about 200 miles south of the mouth of the Mississippi River on a northerly heading. At 5:10 a.m., her radar picked up a target off to the left at a distance of about 14 miles. This was really nothing unusual because they were under heavily traveled air lanes. The early morning watch is always rough, and as the small group of officers and men in the Combat Information Center quietly watched the target with a noticeable lack of enthusiasm, it moved south, made a turn, and headed back to the north again. A few of the men noticed that the turn looked a little different, but this early in the morning they didn't give it much thought. At 5:14, the target went off the scope to the north. At 5:16 it was back, and the lassitude was instantly gone. Now the target was 22 miles south of the ship. No one in the CIC had to draw a picture. Something, in 2 minutes, had disappeared off the scope to the north, made a big swing around the ship, out of radar range, and had swung in from the south. Word went up to the lookouts. They tensed up and began to scan the sky. The radar contacts continued. This second contact, south of the ship, was held for 2 full minutes as the target moved out from 22 to 55 miles. Then it faded. At 5:20 the target was back, but now it was north of the ship again, and it was hovering. Again the lookouts were called. Could they see anything now? Their "no" answers didn't hold for long, because seconds later their terse reports began to come in to the CIC. A brilliant light, like a planet, was streaking across the northwest sky about 30 degrees above the horizon. Unfortunately, the radar had lost contact for a moment when the visual report came in. At 5:37, the target disappeared from the scopes and was gone for good. The Seabago case was ended, but the UFOs continued to fly. Reports continued to come into the Air Force, and a lot of investigators lost a lot of sleep. The next day at 3:50 p.m., the CO of an Air Force weather detachment at Long Beach, California, and 12 airmen watched 6 saucer-shaped UFOs streak along under the bases of a 7,000-foot high cloud deck. On the same day, also in Long Beach, officers and men at the Los Alamitos Naval Air Station saw UFOs almost continuously between the hours of 6:05 and 7:25 p.m. Long Beach police reported well over 100 calls during this same period. During November and December of 1957, it was a situation of you name the city and there was a UFO report from there. Trying to sift them out and put them in a book would be like sorting out a plateful of spaghetti. And if you succeeded, you would have a document the size of the New York City telephone directory. Most of the reports were explained. The Levelland, Texas sightings were written off as St. Elmo's fire. The military police at the White Sands Proving Ground saw the moon through broken clouds, and the crew of the Coast Guard ship Seabago were actually tracking several separate aircraft. The 1957 flap was as great as the previous record-breaking 1952 flap. During 1957, the Air Force received 1,178 UFO reports. Of these, only 20 were placed in the unknown list. In comparison to 1957, The first months of 1958 were a doldrums. Reports drifted in at a leisurely pace, and the Air Force UFO investigating teams, blooded during the avalanche of 1957, picked off solutions like knocking off clay pipes in a shooting gallery. In Los Angeles, a few clear nights drove the Air Defense Command nuts. People could actually see the sky, and the sight of so many stars frightened them. Unusual atmospherics in Georgia made stars jump and radars go crazy, and a balloon hanging over Chicago at dusk cost the taxpayers another several $1,000s, but the pilots made their flight pay. A statement by Dr. Carl Jung, renowned Swiss psychologist, was widely publicized in July 1958. Dr. Jung was quoted as saying, in a letter to a U.S. saucer club, "UFOs are real." When Dr. Jung read what he was supposed to have written, the Alps rang with screams of "misquote." No one got excited until the early morning of September 29th. Shortly before dawn on that day, a confusing mess of reports began to pour into the Air Force. Some came from the Washington, D.C. area. People right in NICAP's backyard told of seeing a large, round, fiery object shoot across the sky from southeast to northwest. A few excited observers, all from the country northwest of Washington, had seen it land, and even as they telephoned in their reports, they could see it glowing behind a neighbor's barn. Other reports, also of a huge, round, fiery object, came in from such places as Pittsburgh, Somerset, and Bedford, all in Pennsylvania, and Hagerstown and Frederick in Maryland. To add to the confusion, people in Pennsylvania reported seeing 3 objects flying in formation. When the dust settled, Air Force investigators took the first step in the solution of any UFO report. They plotted the sightings on a map and collated the directions of flight, descriptions, and times of observation. It was obvious that the object had moved along a line between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh. It was traveling about 7,000 miles an hour, and everyone had obviously seen the same object. By the time it had passed into Pennsylvania, it had split into 3 objects. But the hooker was the reported landings northeast of Washington. Too many people had reported a glow on the ground to write this factor off even though an investigator, dispatched to the scene shortly after dawn, had found nothing in the way of evidence. One possibility was that some unknown object had streaked across the sky, landed, and then took off again. Could be, but it wasn't. The next night the case broke. The glow from the landing was a bright floodlight on a barn. No one had ever really noticed it before until the object passed nearby. A few days later the object itself was identified. From the many identical descriptions, Project Blue Book's astrophysicist pinned it down as a large meteor. The meteor had broken up near the end of its flight to produce the illusion of 3 objects flying in formation. Of all the 590 UFO reports the Air Force received in 1958, probably the weirdest was solved before it was ever reported. About 4 o'clock on the afternoon of October 2, 1958, 3 men were standing in a group, talking, outside a tungsten mill at Danby, California, right in the heart of the Mojave Desert. The men had been talking for about 5 minutes when one of them, who happened to be facing the northwest, stopped right in the middle of a sentence and pointed. The other 2 men looked and to their astonishment saw a brilliant glow of light. It was so close to the horizon that it was difficult to tell if it was on the horizon or in the air just above it. At first the men ignored the light, but as it persisted, they became more interested. They'd all heard flying saucer stories, and, they later admitted, this possibility entered their minds. As they watched, they speculated. It could be something natural, but all of them had been around this area for months, and they'd never seen this light before. About the time they decided to get a telescope and take a closer look, the light suddenly faded. All the next day, the men kept glancing off toward the northwest as they worked, but the clear blue sky was blank. Then at 4:00 p.m. the light was back. This time they had a telescope. All the men took turns looking at the object, and all agreed that it was about 15 feet long, 5 feet high, and solid. It looked like the sun reflecting off shiny metal. It was about 4 miles away, they estimated, and almost exactly on the horizon. Now the men's curiosity was thoroughly whetted. Martian spaceship or whatever, they were going after it. But a several-hour search of the area produced nothing, and as soon as they left the mill they lost sight of the object. Darkness brought the search to a halt. The next day at 4:00 p.m. a crowd had gathered and the UFO kept its appointment. Again the men studied the object and tension ran high. Someone had resurrected the stories of UFOs landing in the desert. At the time they'd sounded absurd, but now, standing there looking at a UFO, it was different. A party of men were all ready to jeep out into the desert to make another search when one of them made a discovery. There were guy wires coming out of the UFO and running down into the trees. Other people looked. And then the solution hit like a fireball. Exactly in line with the UFO and 10 miles away, not 4, was a set of antennas for the California State Highway Patrol radio. The sun's rays were reflecting from these antennas. They'd never seen this before because on only a few days during the year was the sun at exactly the right angle to produce the reflection. The men were right. In a few days the Danby UFO left and it never came back. 1958 was not a record year for UFOs. The 590 reports received didn't stack up to the 1,178 for 1957, or the 778 for 1956, or the 918 for 1952. But a new record was set when the percentage of unknowns was pared down to a new low. During 1958, only 0.9% of the reports, or 5 reports, were classified as unknown. More manpower, better techniques, and just plain old experience has allowed the Air Force to continually lower the percentage of unknowns from 20% while I was in charge of Project Blue Book to less than 1% today. No story of the UFO would be complete without describing one of these unknowns, so here's one exactly as it came out of the Project Blue Book files. On 31 October 1958, this center received a TWX reporting a UFO near Loch Raven Dam. A request for a detailed investigation was sent to the nearest Air Force base. The following is a summary of the incident and subsequent investigation. 2 civilians were driving around near Loch Raven Dam on the evening of 26 October 1958. When they rounded a curve about 200 to 300 yards from a bridge, they saw what appeared to be a large, flat, egg-shaped object hovering about 100 to 150 feet above the bridge superstructure. They slowed their car, and when they got to within 75 or 80 feet of the bridge, their engine quit and their lights went out. The driver immediately stepped on the brakes and stopped the car. Attempts were made to start the car, and when this was unsuccessful, They became frightened and got out of the car. They put the car between them and the object and watched for approximately 30 to 45 seconds. The object then seemed to flash a brilliant white light, and both men felt heat on their faces. Then there was heard a loud noise and the object began rising vertically. The object became very bright while rising, and its shape could not be seen as it rose. It disappeared in 5 to 10 seconds. After the object disappeared, the car was started, and they turned it around and drove to where a phone was located and contacted the Towson Police Department. 2 patrolmen were sent to meet them. The 2 men told the patrolmen of their experience. The witnesses then noticed a burning sensation on their faces and became concerned about possible radiation burns. They went to a Baltimore hospital for an examination. Both witnesses were advised by the doctor that they had no reason for concern. An extensive investigation was made concerning this incident. However, no valid conclusion could be made as to the possible nature of the sighting, and it remains unidentified. So ended 1958, and in its final tally of sightings for the year, Project Blue Book added a new space-age touch. Earth satellites had accounted for 11 UFO reports. 1959 came in with a good one. We used to call these reports ground-air visual radar sightings, and they make interesting reading. At Duluth, Minnesota, in March, it's dark by 5 o'clock in the evening. It's cold. The temperature hovers around 0, and it's so clear you have a feeling you can almost reach up and touch the stars. It was this kind of a night on March 13, 1959, and as the officers and men of the Air Defense Command Fighter Squadron at the Duluth Municipal Airport moved, they shuffled along slowly because the heavy parkas and Arctic clothing they wore were heavy. Then came the UFO report, and things speeded up. At 5:20 p.m. exactly, the operations officer noted the time, word came in over the comm line that someone had sighted an unidentified flying object off to the north. Word flashed around the squadron, and as people rushed out of buildings to look, they were joined by those already outside. And there it was, big, round, and bright, and it was moving at high speed. Some observers thought it was greenish, others reddish, but it was something, and it was there. The bearing was 300 degrees from the base. It was an awesome sight, and it became even more awesome when a quick call to an adjacent radar site brought back the word that they had just picked up a target on a bearing of 300 degrees from the airbase. They were tracking it and taking scope photos. In the alert hangar, the 2 pilots standing the alert had been listening to a running account of the sighting, so when the scramble bell rang, they took off for their airplanes like a couple of sprinters. As the 2 big alert hangar doors swung up, the whining screech of the jet starters, followed by thunder of the engines, filled the airfield. The atmosphere around the Duluth Municipal Airport was closely akin to Santa Anita the instant the starting gates open. I've been around when jet interceptors scramble, and you can twang the tension with your finger. As the people on the ground watched, they could first see the flame of the jet's afterburner disappear into the night. Then the jet's navigation lights faded out on a bearing of 300 degrees. At the radar site they still had the target, and there were many excited people watching the big pale, orange scopes as 2 little bright points of light began to close on a bigger blob of light. Then the pilots gave the tally-ho, they were in visual contact. But the tally-ho had no more been given than the big blob of light on the target began to pull away from the fighters, and was soon off the scope. The pilots kept visual contact, though, and the radio provided the details of the chase to the now blind crew in the radar room. The two jets bored north, with afterburner on, and the needles on their machmeters passed the 1.0 mark. But still the UFO was just as far away as it had ever been. The chase went on for a few minutes more before the pilots pulled their throttles back into the cruise position, turned, and came home. Even before they landed, the people at the airbase saw the big, round and bright UFO rapidly begin to fade, and then it was gone. So ended the glamour, and the dog work began. Each man who had seen the UFO visually was carefully interrogated. Weather reports were collected. Radarscope photos were developed. The two pilots received special attention. The exact bearing of the UFO was measured and 300 degrees magnetic was correct. The bundle of data was packed up and sent to Project Blue Book. The panel of experts convened. First, the radarscope photos were examined. "Those targets could be interference from other radars," said the radar expert, and he mentally ticked off 12 other similar cases of known interference. The weather data and locations and frequencies of other radars were checked out. Beyond doubt it was interference from another radar that caused the target. Now the visual sighting. Balloon? No, the fighters could have caught a balloon in seconds. Airplane? Same answer. These jets were the fastest things in the air. Planet or star? Out came the almanacs, and the puzzle went to the astrophysicist. Venus was on a bearing of 300 degrees from the Duluth Municipal Airport at 5:20 p.m. on March 23rd. But Venus was just below the horizon at that time, and the observers said the UFO was moving fast. Once again the weather charts were studied. The atmospheric conditions were such that it was very possible that due to refraction, Venus would have been visible just on the horizon. The fact that the UFO faded so fast would bear this out, because the conditions for such refraction are critical, and a slight change in atmospheric conditions could easily have caused the planet to disappear. The speed, a common illusion. Further interrogation of the observers showed it had never moved. So the history of the UFO is almost brought up to date. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 19. Off They Go into the Wild Blue Yonder. At 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 20th, 1952, history was made. At least, so says George Adamski, lecturer on philosophy and student of technical matters and astronomy. At 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 20th, 1952, George Adamski was the first man on Earth to talk to a Venusian. At least, so says George Adamski. I was chief of Project Blue Book at the time, and the name Professor Adamski, he had a title then, wasn't new to me. He or some of his followers had been showering the Air Force with photos of flying saucers. Letters by the gross were coming in demanding recognition of the great professor and an analysis of his photos. We obliged, and the photos were examined by the experts at Wright-Patterson Photo Reconnaissance Labs. The verdict came back, "They could be genuine, of course, but they also could have been easily faked by a 10-year-old with a Brownie camera." For a few weeks we forgot George Adamski. But then the press began to clamor at our gates. The news was leaking out of Southern California. George Adamski had talked to a Venusian. We held out for a long time, but the pressure mounted, and I headed for California to find out what it was all about. As far as George Adamski was concerned, I was just another thirsty sightseer from the famous observatory on Mount Palomar when I walked into the little restaurant at the foot of this famous mountain one day in 1953. The four-stool restaurant, with a few tables, where Adamski worked as a handyman, was crowded when I arrived, and he was circulating around serving beer and picking up empty bottles. There was no doubt as to who he was because his fame had spread. To the dozen almost reverently spoken queries, "Are you Adamski?" he modestly nodded his head. Small questions about the flying saucer photos for sale from convenient racks led to more questions, and before long the good "professor" had taken a position in the middle of the room and was off and running. In his slightly broken English he told how he was the son of poor Polish immigrants with hardly any formal education. To look at the man and to listen to his story, you had an immediate urge to believe him. Maybe it was his appearance. He was dressed in well-worn but neat overalls. He had slightly graying hair and the most honest pair of eyes I've ever seen. Or maybe it was the way he told his story. He spoke softly and naïvely, almost pathetically, giving the impression that most people think I'm crazy, but honestly, I'm really not. Adamski started his story by telling how he had spent many long and cold nights at his telescope at the request of the government trying to photograph one of the flying saucers everyone had been talking about. He'd been successful, as the full photograph racks on the wall showed, and he thought the next step would be to actually try to contact a saucer. For some reason, Adamski didn't know exactly why, on November 19th he'd decided to go out into the Mojave Desert. He'd called some friends and told them to meet him there. By noon the next day the party, which consisted of Adamski and 6 others, had met and were eating lunch near the town of Desert Center on the California-Arizona border. They looked for saucers, but except for an occasional airplane, the cloudless blue sky was empty. They were about ready to give it up as a bad day when another airplane came over. Again they looked up, but this time, in addition to seeing the airplane, they saw a silvery, cigar-shaped flying saucer. For some reason, again he didn't know why, the group of people moved down the road where Adamski left them and took off into the desert alone. By this time the spaceship had disappeared and once again Adamski was about to give up. Then a flash of light caught his eye and a smaller saucer, he later learned it was a scout ship, came drifting down and landed about a half-mile from him. He swung his camera into action and started to take pictures. Unfortunately, the one picture Adamski had to show was so out of focus the scout ship looked like a desert rock. He took a few more pictures, he told his audience, and had stopped to admire the little scout ship when he suddenly noticed a man standing nearby. Now, even those in the crowded restaurant who had been smirking when he started his story had put down their beers and were listening. This is what they had come to hear. You could actually have heard the proverbial pin drop. Adamski told what went through his mind when he first saw the man. Maybe a prospector. but he noticed the man's long, shoulder-length, sandy-colored hair, his dark skin, his Oriental features, and his ski-pant-type trousers. He was puzzled. Then it came to his mind like a flash: he was looking at a person from some other world. Through mental pictures, sign language, and a few words of English, Adamski found out the man was from Venus. He was friendly, and that they, the Venusians, were worried about radiation from our atomic bombs. They talked. George pointed to his camera, but the man from Venus politely refused to be photographed. Adamski pleaded to go into the ship to see how it operated, but the Venusian refused this too. They talked some more, of spaceships and of solar systems, before Adamski walked with his newfound friend to the saucer and saw the Venusian off into space. At this point Adamski recalled how he had glanced up in the sky to see the air full of military aircraft. Needless to say, the rest of Adamski's party, who had supposedly seen the contact from a mile away, were excited. They rushed up to him, and it was then that they noticed the footprints. Plainly imprinted in the desert sand were curious markings made by ridges on the soles of the Venusian's shoes. At the urging of the crowd in the restaurant, Adamski took an old shoe box out from under the counter. One of his party that day had just happened to have some plaster of Paris, and the shoe box contained plaster casts of shoe prints with strange, hieroglyphic-like symbols on the soles. No one in the restaurant asked how the weight of a mere man could make such sharp imprints in the dry, coarse desert sand. Next he showed the sworn statements of the witnesses, and the crowd moved in around him for a better look. As I left he was graciously filling people in on more details, and the cash register was merrily ringing up saucer picture sales. I didn't write the trip off as a complete loss. The weather in California was beautiful. Adamski held the UFO spotlight for some time. The Venusians paid him another visit, this time at the restaurant, and he photographed their ship. This, whether by Venusian fate or design, increased the flow of traffic to the restaurant at the base of Mount Palomar. It also had its side effects. An astronomer from the observatory that houses the world-famous 200-inch telescope on top of Mount Palomar told me, "I hate to admit it, but the number of week-end visitors has picked up here. People drive down to hear George and decide that since they're down here they might as well come up and see our establishment." But George Adamski didn't hold the front center of the stage for long. In rapid succession others stepped forward and hesitantly admitted that they too had been contacted. Truman Bethurum, a journeyman mechanic of Redondo Beach, California, was next up. Actually, he admitted, he had been the first Earthman to talk to a person from another world. Back on the night of July 26, 1952, 4 months before Adamski, a group of 8 or 10 short, olive-skinned men with black wavy hair had awakened him while he was asleep in a truck in the desert near Mormon Flats, Nevada. These little men, unlike Adamski's, spoke any language. "You name it," they'd quipped to Bethurum, "we speak it." In a newspaper article that was voted Best Read of 1953, Bethurum told how the little man he met had been more cooperative and had actually taken him into their saucer, a huge job, 300 feet in diameter and 16 feet high. Once inside, Bethurum had met the captain of the scow, a true leader of men. Ora Raines was her name, and she was a Venus de Milo with arms and warm blood. When she spoke, her words rhymed. They chatted, and Bethurum learned that he was on the Admiral's scow, the command ship of Clarion's fleet of saucers. All in all, Bethurum made 11 visits to Aura's scow. Each time they'd sit and talk. Bethurum told her about the earth, and she told of the idyllic Shangri-La type planet of Clarion, a yet undiscovered planet which is always opposite the moon. But before too long, both Truman Bethurum and George Adamski had to move over. Daniel Fry, an engineer, stepped in. At a press conference to kick off the International Saucer Convention in Los Angeles, Fry told how he had not only contacted the spacemen 2 years before Adamski and Bethurum, he had actually ridden in a flying saucer. It had all started on the night of July 4, 1950, when engineer Fry was temporarily employed at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. It was a hot night, and with nothing else to do, Fry decided to take a walk across the desert. He hadn't traveled far when he saw a bluish light hovering over the mountains which rimmed this famous proving ground. He paid no attention. He'd heard flying saucer stories before and just plain didn't believe them. But as he watched, the light came closer and closer and closer, until a weird craft came silently to rest on the desert floor not 70 feet away. For seconds, Fry, who had seen missile-age developments at White Sands that would have dumbfounded most laymen, merely stood and stared. The object, Fry told newsmen, was an ovate spheroid about 30 feet at the equator. Fry has a habit of drifting off into the technical. Its outside surface was a highly polished silver, with a slight violet iridescent glow. At first Fry wanted to run, but his rigid technical training overrode his common natural urges. He decided to go over to the object and see what made it tick. He circled it several times, and nothing broke the desert silence. Then he touched it. "Better not touch that hull, pal, it's hot," boomed a voice in a Hollywoodian tone. Fry recoiled. The voice softened and added, "Take it easy, pal, you're among friends." After politely reading off the spaceman, or whoever he was, for scaring him, Pal Fry and the voice settled down for a friendly moonlight chat. Fry learned that the voice was indeed that of a spaceman, and they were down to pick up a new supply of air. After about 4 years of Earth air transfusions, according to the spaceman, they would become adapted to our atmosphere and our gravity and become immunized to your biotics. The craft, Fry was told, was a cargo carrier, unmanned and built to zoom down and scoop up Earth air. The conversation went on, waxing technical at times, and ended with an invitation to look into the ship. Then the spaceman, possibly carried away by all the interest Fry was showing, offered a ride. Fry accepted, and they anti-demagnetized off for New York City. 30 minutes later they were back at White Sands. Over New York City they came down from 35 to 20 miles, and Fry could read the marquee of the Fulton Theater. The 7-Year Itch was playing. He hadn't told the Air Force about his ride before because he was afraid he'd lose his job. But at the press conference he did plug his new book, The White Sands Incident. By this time Adamski had already published his book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, and it looked as if Fry was going to cut him out. But Fry took a lie detector test on a widely viewed West Coast television show and flunked it flat. His stock dropped as fast as it had risen, but the decline was somewhat checked when a well-known Southern California medium wrote to her old friend, J. Edgar Hoover, about the situation. Hoover, the story goes, shot back an answer: "Lie detectors are no good." But the damage had been done. The rigged lie detector test had unfortunately relegated Daniel Fry, engineer, missile expert, part owner of an engineering plant, and interplanetary hitchhiker, to the Bush League. With Adamski and Bethurum on the stage and Fry peeking out of the wings, all hell broke loose. One could say that everyone tried to get into the act, but I'd rather think that each colony of space people tried to promote their own candidate. In England, one Cedric Allingham met a Martian on the moors. In France, Germany, the United States, Portugal, Brazil, Spain, everywhere, people too uneducated to pull a hoax met green men, dark men, white men, big men with little heads, little men with big heads, and men with pointed heads. They wore motorcycle belts, baggy pants, diver suits, and were naked. One lady proudly announced that a Venusian had tried to seduce her, and within days another snorted in disgust. A Martian had seduced her. Then Adamski took a hop through outer space and back. Saucers poured forth words of wisdom via radio, light beams, and mental telepathy. All of these messages were duly recorded on tape, and sales were hot at $4.50 per 10-minute tape. Not to be outdone by any other lousy planet, the Venusians picked up a young man from Los Angeles and actually took him to Venus. Not once, but 3 times. He packed in audiences by telling how he had been contacted one night and asked by a strange man if he would go on an important mission. Afraid, but not one to shirk his patriotic duties, he met the stranger at a prearranged spot and was whisked off to Venus. During a high-level conference up there he was given the word, "Tell the Earthlings to lay off their atomic weapons or else. They're killing all our doves, and we make our flying saucers out of the feathers our live doves shed." The Venusians, this space traveler warned his audiences, were already infiltrating the earth, and he intimated that they were ready to move in case we didn't cease atomic testing. His next 2 trips to Venus were purely social. The highlight of his lecture, when he awes his audience, is when he whips out his proof. 1. A blood smear on a slide, genuine Venusian blood. 2. An affidavit from his landlady stating he wasn't home on 3 occasions, and 3. A photo of a Venusian walking in Los Angeles' MacArthur Park. The mere fact that the Venusian looks like any Joe Dokes walking down the street is a picayunish point. Venusians look just like us. And it hasn't stopped. During the big UFO flap of 1957, a man stumbled into a landing saucer and chatted a while with its occupants. A few months later, soon after the atomic-powered USS Nautilus made its historic trip under the polar ice cap, this same man snorted in disgust. He packed his suitcase and started on a lecture tour. Months before, he'd been there in a flying saucer. Once again, people shelled out hard cash to hear his story. Wherever you are, Mr. P.T. Barnum, you are undoubtedly grinning from ear to ear. But there is a sober side to this apparently comical picture. The common undertone to many of these stories, hot from the lips of a spaceman, is utopia. On these other worlds there is no illness, and they've learned how to cure all diseases. There are no wars. They've learned how to live peaceably. There is no poverty. Everyone has everything he wants. There is no old age. They've learned the secret of eternal life. Too many times this subtle pitch can be boiled down to, "Step right up, folks, and put a donation in the pot. I'm just on the verge of learning the spacemen's secrets, and with a little money to carry out my work, I'll give you the secret." I've seen a man, crippled by arthritis, hobbling out into the desert in hopes that his "friend who talks to the Martians" could get them to cure him on their next trip. I've seen pensioners, who needed every buck they had, shell out money to help buy radio equipment, to contact some planet to find out how they'd solve their economic problems. I saw a little old lady in a many times mended dress put down a $10 bill to help promote a "peace campaign" backed by the Venusians. She'd lost 2 sons in the war, but had 4 grandsons she wanted to keep alive. A couple died and left $15,000 to a man to build a longevity machine so others could live. The Martians had given him the plans. A woman died of thirst and exposure in the Mojave Desert, trying to reach the spot where a man told her he was going to make a contact. Some of it isn't comical. Even though the field is becoming crowded, through thick and thin, Martian and Venusian, the old maestro, George Adamski, is still head and shoulders above the rest. The hamburger stand is boarded up, and he lives in a big ranch house. He vacations in Mexico, and has his own clerical staff. His 2 books, Flying Saucers Have Landed and Inside the Spaceships, have sold something in the order of 200,000 copies, and have been translated into nearly every language except Russian. To date, he's had 11 visits from people from Mars, Venus, and Saturn. Evidently, Truman Bethuram's Aura Rhanes put out the word about Earthmen, because 2 beautiful spacewomen have now entered Adamski's life, an incredibly lovely blonde named Kalna and the equally beautiful Ilmuth. Only a few months ago, while on one of his numerous nationwide lecture tours, a saucer unexpectedly picked Adamski up in Kansas City and took him on a galactic cruise before depositing him at Fort Madison, Iowa, where he had a lecture date. He wowed the packed auditorium with his proof, an unused Kansas City to Fort Madison train ticket. Last week in the Netherlands, Adamski's nationwide tours have expanded to worldwide tours, he repeated his exploits to Queen Juliana. But at Buckingham Palace, Mr. Barnum, all he saw was the changing of the guard. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 20 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 20. Do They or Don't They? During the past 4 years, the most frequent question I've been asked is, "What do you personally think? Do unidentified flying objects exist or don't they?" I'm positive they don't. I was very skeptical when I finished my tour of active duty with the Air Force and left Project Blue Book in 1953, but now I'm convinced. Since I left the Air Force, the age of the satellite has arrived and we're in it. Along with this new era came the long-range radars, the satellite tracking cameras, and the other instruments that would have picked up any type of spaceship coming into our atmosphere. None of this instrumentation has ever given any indication of any type of unknown vehicle entering the Earth's atmosphere. I checked this with the Department of Defense, and I checked this through friends associated with tracking projects. In both cases, the results were completely negative. There's not even a glimmer of hope for the UFO. Then there's Project Moonwatch, the optical satellite tracking program for the International Geophysical Year. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the director of Moonwatch, wrote to me, "I can quite safely say that we have no record of ever having received from our Moonwatch teams any reports of sightings of unidentified objects which had any characteristics different from those of an orbiting satellite, a slow meteor, or of a suspected plane mistaken for a satellite." Dr. Hynek should know. He has investigated and analyzed more UFO reports than any other scientist in the world. And the third convincing point is that 12 years have passed since the first UFO report was made, and still there is not one shred of material evidence of anything unknown and no photos of anything other than meaningless blobs of light. The next question that always arises is, "But people are seeing something. Experienced observers, like pilots, scientists, and radar operators, have reported UFOs." To be very frank, we heard the words "experienced observer" so many times, these words soon began to make us ill. Everyone, except housewives with myopia, were experienced observers. Pilots, scientists, a term used equally as loosely, engineers, radar operators, everyone who reported a UFO was some kind of an experienced observer. This man had taught aircraft recognition during World War II. He was an experienced observer. That man spent 4 years in the Air Force. He was an experienced observer. We soon learned that everyone is an experienced observer as long as what he sees is familiar to him. As soon as he sees something unfamiliar, it's a UFO. Pilots probably come as close to falling into this category as anyone, since they do spend a lot of time looking around the sky. But even those who can rattle off the names and locations of stars, planets, and constellations don't know about a few relatively rare astronomical phenomena. The bolide, or supermeteor, is a good example. Few pilots have ever, or will ever, see a deluxe model bolide, but when they do, they'll never forget it. It's like something shooting a flare in front of your face. There are a number of reports of bolides in the Blue Book files, and each pilot who made each report called each bolide a UFO. The descriptions are almost identical to the classic descriptions of bolides found in astronomy books. While on the subject of meteors, if most people realized that meteors can have a flat trajectory, they can go from horizon to horizon, they can travel in formation or groups, and they can be seen in daylight as large silver disks, the work of UFO investigators would be lighter. Enough of meteors, and back to our experienced observers. The example of pilots and bolides holds true in many other cases. Take high-flying jets, for example. To a person in an area where there isn't much high-altitude air traffic, a thin, blood-red streak in the sky at sunset, or shortly after, is a UFO. To anyone in an area where there are a lot of high-flying jets, even our myopic housewife, it's just another vapor trail. They're as common as the sunset. When the flashing red strobe lights, now used on practically all aircraft, were still in the experimental stage back in 1951, they gave us fits. Every time an airplane with one of these flashing lights made a flight, people within miles, including other pilots, called in UFO reports. Now these strobe lights are common and no one even bothers to look up. The same held true, and still does, for the odd array of lights used on tanker planes during aerial refueling operations. Some phenomena are so rare and so little is known about them that they are always UFOs. The most common is the disk following the airplane. I've never heard an explanation for this phenomenon, but it exists, and I've seen it on 3 occasions. Maybe a dense blob of air tears off the airplane, floats along behind, and reflects the sunlight. Whatever it is, it gives the illusion of a saucer chasing an airplane. Sometimes it's steady and sometimes it darts back and forth. It only stays in view a few seconds, and when it disappears, it fades and looks for all the world as if it's suddenly streaking away into the distance. Birds, bees, bugs, airplanes, planets, stars, balloons, and a host of other common everyday objects become UFOs the instant they are viewed under other than normal situations. Then there is radar. This poor inanimate piece of electronic equipment has taken a beating when UFO proof is being offered. Radar is not subject to the frailties of the human mind, is the outcry of every saucer fan, and radar has seen UFOs. Radar is no better than the radar observer, and the radar observer has a mind. And where there's a mind, there is the same old trouble. If the presentation on the radar scope doesn't look like it has looked for years, a UFO is being tracked. Radar is temperamental. The scope presentation of each radar has certain peculiarities and an operator gets used to seeing these. Occasionally, and for some unknown reason, these peculiarities suddenly change. For months, a temperature inversion may cause 50 or 75 targets to appear on the radar scope. The operator has learned to recognize them and knows that they are caused by weather. They are not UFOs. But overnight something changes, and now this same temperature inversion causes only 1 or 2 targets. The operator isn't used to seeing this, and the targets are now UFOs. Many times we'd stumble across the fact that after the first report of a UFO being tracked on radar, the same identical type of target would be tracked again many times. But by this time, the operator would have learned that they were caused by weather and it wouldn't be reported to us. It is interesting to note that, to my knowledge, there has never been a radar sighting classed as unknown when radarscope photos were taken. The reason is simple. The radar operator can take ample time to re-examine what he had to interpret in seconds during the actual sighting. Also, more experienced radar operators have a chance to examine the scope presentation. Mixed in with the fact that there are few really qualified observers on this earth is the power of suggestion. About the time someone yells UFO and points, all powers of reasoning come to a screeching halt. We saw this happen day after day. Few people I ever talked to, once they had decided they were looking at a UFO, stopped to calmly say to themselves, "Now, couldn't this be a balloon, star, planet, or something else explainable?" In one instance, I traveled halfway across the United States to investigate a report made by a high-ranking man in the State Department, an experienced observer. It was evening by the time I got to talk to him, and after he'd excitedly told me all the pertinent facts, how this bright fight had jumped across the sky, he said, "Want to see it? It's still there, but it's not jumping now." We went outside, and there was Jupiter. Then there was the UFO over Dayton, Ohio in the summer of 1952. I first heard about it at home. It was about 6 in the evening when the phone rang, and it was one of the tower operators at Patterson Field. The tower operators at Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio, 60 miles east of Dayton, had spotted 3 fiery spheres flying in a V formation over their base. 2 F-84s had been scrambled to intercept, and they were in the air right now. so far, the tower operator told me, the intercept had been unsuccessful because the objects were traveling 2,000 to 3,000 miles an hour and were too high for the old F-84s. He was monitoring the two jets' radio conversation and he puts his telephone near the speaker. I heard, "At 28,000 and still above us. High speed. Headed toward Wright-Patterson. Low on fuel, going home." I made it to my car in record time and took off toward Wright-Patterson, about 12 miles from where I was living. It was still light, although the sun was low, and as I drove I kept looking toward the east. Nothing. I reached the gate, showed my pass to the guard, and had just written the whole thing off as another UFO report when I saw them. They convinced me. Off to the east of the airbase were three objects that can best be described as three half-sized suns. By the time I arrived at base operations, there were 3 or 4 dozen people on the ramp, all looking up. The standard comment was, "Look at them go!" About this time, a C-54 transport taxied up and stopped. It was the Kitty Hawk flight from Washington, and I knew several people who got off. One passenger, an officer from ATIC, ran up to me and handed me a roll of film. "Here's some pictures of them," he said breathlessly. "I never thought I'd see one." The next passengers I recognized were 2 other officers, Ph.D. psychologists from the Aero Medical Laboratory. I knew them because they had visited Blue Book many times, collecting data for a paper they were writing on UFOs. The title of the paper was to be "The Psychological Aspects of UFO Sightings." Almost climbing over each other in their effort to tell their story, they told me how they had watched the UFOs from the C-54. Both had seen them dogfighting between themselves. "How fast were they going?" I asked. "Like hell," was their only answer, but the way they said it and the looks on their faces emphasized their statement. The crowd on the ramp had increased by now, and some of the newcomers had binoculars. The men with the binoculars were the focal point of several individual groups as they watched and gave blow-by-blow accounts. Some of the crowd were talking about jet fighters, and it suddenly dawned on me that just across the parking lot was the operations office of the local ADC jet outfit, the 97th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. I ran over to Interceptor Operations and went in. I knew the duty officer because several times before the 97th people had chased balloons over Dayton. When I told him about the UFOs, all I received was a rather uninterested stare. When I said they were over the base, he did me the courtesy of going out to look. He came running back in and hit the scramble button. 3 minutes later, 2 F-86s were heading UFO-ward. They soon disappeared, but their vapor trails kept the tense crowd informed of their progress. And believe me, there was tension. As the vapor trail spiraled up, first as 2 distinct plumes, and later only one, as they blended at altitude, more than one pilot standing on the ramp expressed his thankfulness for his unenviable position, on the ground, watching. The vapor trails thinned out and disappeared right under the 3 UFOs, and it was obvious that the 2 jets had closed in. Here were 3 that didn't escape. That night, the 97th Fighter Interceptor Squadron added 3 more balloons to their record. The F-86s had been able to climb higher than the F-84s. The next morning, photos confirmed the balloons. They had been tethered together and carried an instrument package. I had been fooled. 2 Ph.D. psychologists who had studied UFOs had been fooled. A C-54 load of experienced observers, many pilots, had been fooled. The tower operators had been fooled, and so had 100 others. This was an interesting sighting, and we used to discuss it a lot. All of the observers later agreed that what made them so excited was the tower operators' announcement, "F-84s from Lockbourne are chasing 3 high-speed objects." This set the stage, and from then on no one even considered the fact that if the objects had been traveling 2,000 or 3,000 miles an hour, they would have been long gone in the 15 minutes we watched them. Secondly, I found out that the C-54, a slow airplane, had actually overtaken and passed the balloons between Columbus and Dayton, but none of the passengers I talked to had stopped to think of this. And I'm positive that in our minds the balloons, which were about 40 feet in diameter and at 40,000 feet, looked a lot larger than they actually were. I know the power of suggestion plays an important role in UFO sightings. Once you're convinced you're looking at a UFO, you can see a lot of things. But then there's the unknowns. Any good saucer fan, wild-eyed or sober, will magnanimously concede that a certain percentage of the UFO sightings are the misidentification of known objects. They drag out the unknowns as the proof. Technically speaking, an unknown report is one that has been made by a reliable observer, not necessarily experienced. The report has been exhaustively investigated and analyzed, and there is no logical explanation. To this, the Air Force says, "The Air Force emphasizes the belief that if more immediate detailed objective observational data could have been obtained on the unknowns, these too could have been satisfactorily explained." I think the case of the Lubbock Lights is an excellent example of this. It is probably one of the most thoroughly investigated reports in the UFO files, and it contained the most precise observational data we ever received. Scientists from far and near tried to solve it. It remained an unknown. The men who made the original sightings stuck by the case and furnished the more detailed objective observational data the Air Force speaks of. The mysterious lights appeared again, and instead of looking for something high in the air, they looked for something low, and found the solution. The world-famous Lubbock Lights were night-flying moths reflecting the bluish-green light of a nearby row of mercury vapor streetlights. I will go a step further than the Air Force, however, and quote from a letter from ex-Lieutenant Andy Flues, once an investigator for Project Blue Book. Flues's statement sums up my beliefs and, I'm quite sure, the beliefs of everyone who has ever worked on projects Sign, Grudge, or Blue Book. Flues wrote, "Even taking into consideration the highly qualified backgrounds of some of the people who made sightings, there was not one single case which, upon the closest analysis, could not be logically explained in terms of some common object or phenomenon. The only reason there are any unknowns in the UFO files is that an effort is made to be scientific in making evaluations. And being scientific doesn't allow for any educated assuming of missing data or the passing of judgment on the character of the observer. However, this is closely akin to being forced to follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules in a fight with a hood. The investigation of any UFO sighting is an inexact science at the very best. Any UFO investigator, after a few months of being steeped in UFO lore and allowed a few scientific rabbit punches, can make the best of the unknowns look like a piece of well-holed Swiss cheese. But regardless of what I say, or what the Air Force says, or what anyone says, we are stuck with flying saucers. And as long as people report unidentified objects in the air, it's the Air Force's responsibility to explain them. Project Blue Book will live on. No responsible scientist will argue with the fact that other solar systems may be inhabited, and that someday we may meet those people. But it hasn't happened yet, and until that day comes, we're stuck with our space age myth, the UFO. End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline. End of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt.